To conclude this series of webinars, I will summarize the different presentations we've had. I'll go over the key information and useful tips for managing climate-related risks. First, I want to go back to this diagram that Professor Taylor shared with us to better understand how to integrate climate change into forest management planning. This management cycle shows the steps to follow. We start by defining the scope and scale. We set the context, where the woodlot is, who owns it, its history, and so on. This is also when we formulate management objectives. The second step is to characterize and value. Here, we describe the state of the forest using indicators such as tree species composition, stand age, merchantable volume, or wildlife habitat abundance. The third step is to model and forecast. So here, we forecast the evolution of the stand over time using a model. The model can range from an expert's opinion to a computer model. On a small scale, consulting an expert is already a very good starting point. Finally, we plan and report. We analyze different scenarios, the costs, the pros and cons, and choose the best plan to reach the objective. To summarize this diagram in a few words, you need to know what you want and what you have, and understand how it will evolve. Then you need to evaluate and plan to finally manage the woodlot. In the context of climate change, it is recommended to choose objectives that are adapted to this reality. The next step is to assess the woodlot and consider climate-focused scenarios before choosing a final management plan. This is where we look at meaningful indicators in a changing climate, for example, species diversity or carbon stocks. Climate-related risks must also be considered. And speaking of these risks, let's now go over the key information and tips shared throughout this series of webinars. Let's start with the tree species at risk presented by Megan de Graaf. The picture you see on the screen was taken in Windsor. It shows the provincial tree of Nouveau-Brunswick, balsam fir. Unfortunately, it is a tree species at risk. The key information from this webinar is this table that can be very useful for managing the woodlot. It presents the tree species of the Wabanaki Acadian forest and their future potential. This table is also available in French. In general, boreal species adapted to cold climates are expected to decline with climate change, such as balsam fir, while temperate species are expected to adapt better, such as red oak. That said, you must be careful. Not all ecoregions are the same. The Wabanaki Acadian forest covers over 100,000 square kilometers in eastern Canada. Environmental conditions vary from one region to another. So, species' potential to adapt to climate change depends on its location and the characteristics of the region where it is located. Altitude, soil type, proximity to the coast. These are examples of factors that must be taken into consideration. Now, how do we manage in a changing climate? When planning, consider the following. The current species composition. Are there any species at risk? The regeneration layer. Don't forget, this is the future of the woodlot. You also need to consider the site characteristics that might limit composition shifts. You may want to introduce a species, but the soil may not be suitable. As you can see, these factors are important, but that's not all. Both species diversity and complexity are also important. By complexity, we mean age diversity, whether there are snags, coarse woody debris, and other natural elements. Overall, the more diverse and complex a forest is, the better. After discussing tree species at risk, we talked about trout with Loïc d'Orangeville. I don't know if you recognize this place. It's Grand Falls. I took this picture early in September. I must say, I was very surprised not to see the waterfall. When I asked about it, I was told that the dam was closed to conserve water because of the drought we had this summer. I think this photo really captures the risk of drought. When it comes to drought, let's start by saying that New Brunswick has a very favorable water balance compared to the rest of Canada, but it's not immune to drought in the context of climate change. The risk of decline for some species is expected to increase in the coming decades. Some signs are already visible. So 3 factors are important in assessing the risk of drought. First, the type of species, their ability to adapt to drought. Some species can adapt. Then, the conditions of the site, the temperature, the availability of water. And finally, the conditions of the stand. A dense stand means more competition for water. The size of the trees also matters, as larger trees need more water. To manage in a changing climate, diversify the stand, both in species and age structure. Also, encourage species adapted to warmer and drier conditions, such as red oak or white pine, and reduce the proportion of vulnerable species, such as balsam fir. Finally, it is recommended to reduce competition for water through thinning. Studies have shown that thinning significantly reduces the impact of drought. However, keep in mind that the positive effects of thinning decreases over time. Let's move on now to wind, which was presented by Professor Anthony Taylor. This picture of a blowdown was taken in Bathurst. Wind is a natural part of the Wabanaki Acadian forest. Now, predicting wind patterns with climate change is complex. The impact of climate change on wind is uncertain, but you should expect more and not less wind in the future. Studies suggest a potential increase in frequency and intensity of storms, and a potential increase in intensity of hurricanes coming north. To assess wind risk, we look at a tree's ability to withstand wind. This ability depends on various factors. I'll mention a few: crown size, wood strength, and root strength. Now, to manage in a changing climate, promote and encourage mixed wood stands when possible, as they are more resilient to wind. A greater hardwood and pine content increases resilience to wind, while a greater spruce fir content decreases resilience to wind. Be mindful of the topographic exposure. For example, exposed hills by the sea, peaks, or sheltered valleys. The impact of wind varies from one location to another. Be also mindful of the soil rooting layer depth. Is it shallow-rooted, deep-rooted? A tree's stability depends on this factor. Finally, don't forget that trees shield one another. A dense stand is more resistant to wind than an isolated tree. So, openings in a forest reduce the mutual protection between trees and increase vulnerability to wind. Let's continue with pests and diseases presented by Sarah Weatherby. You probably recognize the disease you see on the screen, beach bug disease. This photo was taken in Edmundston. Insects and diseases are a natural part of forest ecosystem, but climate change will amplify their impact. We are likely to see a northward shift of southern pests. With global warming, insects that thrive in cooler, wetter environments could see their numbers decline, and insects from southern regions, which thrive in warmer environments, could migrate north. Climate change will likely lead to an increase in frequency and severity of outbreaks. Warmer winters lead to higher pest survival. An increase in invasive species is also possible. And finally, woodlot owners will be directly affected. treatment costs will be higher, and uncertainty about the future of their woodlots will increase. In a changing climate, it is strongly recommended to promote species diversity and mixed stands with multiple age classes and resilient species. Let's say your woodlot is affected by a pest or a disease. If you only have one tree species in your woodlot, you will likely lose everything. If the stand is diverse, the risk is lower and the loss will be partial. Then think sanitation in the event of invasive species. Respond quickly. Removing infected trees prevents further spread. Also, adopt a strict biosecurity. I'm going to focus on this point for a moment. When you transport firewood, for example, or when you introduce plants in your woodlot, be very careful that the wood or plants are healthy, because it's very easy to introduce and spread a pest or a disease. And getting rid of the problem is very difficult. So again, be careful. Finally, consider integrated pest management. To make it simple, it's an environmentally friendly management approach. It reduces negative impacts on both the environment and human health. Integrated pest management involves implementing various techniques. The technique we often talk about is biological control, which involves using living organisms as predators to control pest populations. Overall, integrated pest management is a complex approach, but it's worth keeping it in mind. Let's focus now on the final risk Roger Collette presented a few minutes ago, wildfires. This picture was taken between Miramichi and Bathurst, where a wildfire occurred this summer. Climate change increases the risk of wildfires. Their frequency and intensity are expected to increase. In Nouveau-Brunswick, even though recent years have not reflected this trend, an increase in wildfires should be expected. Let's now go over the factors impacting the spread and the intensity of wildfires. Of course, there are embers and sparks, extreme heat, and direct flame. Weather and topography also have an impact. Temperature, humidity, wind, the landscape, whether it is a slope, for example. This is important because wildfires travel faster uphill. Then there is quantity, the mass of fuel available, which is a key factor in how fires burn. Finally, there is continuity. Continuously distributed fuels allow fire to spread more quickly and to burn more intensely. To manage in a changing climate, it is recommended to prioritize mixed wood stands and promote hardwood species. Hardwoods are more resistant to fires than softwoods. Reduce fuel loads as much as possible. It is also important to practice wildfire prevention. For example, reduce or even stop your forestry activities in the event of extreme drought. In such conditions, the slightest spark can start a wildfire, so be careful. And be mindful of access points, public roads, camps, and cabins. It is recommended to reduce fuel loads in these areas and keep them clear. Also pay attention to power lines and trees that are close to these lines. In conclusion, managing a woodlot while considering the various climate-related risks we have just mentioned is not an easy task. An action that reduces a stand's vulnerability to one risk can increase its vulnerability to another risk. It is complex, but finding a good balance is possible. That's why different scenarios must be considered to choose the best option. So if you want to manage your woodlot in a changing climate, we recommend consulting an expert to develop a management plan. Keep in mind that change will take time, and will likely require both material and financial investment. You must also accept that no woodlot is risk-free. There will always be some level of risk. Finally, we strongly recommend monitoring your woodlot regularly. If you notice any warning signs, contact an expert quickly. Don't act without seeking advice. And the final word is diversity. This is the key word. The more diverse and complex a stand is, the more resilient it will be to climate change. Thank you for your attention. The New Brunswick Federation of Woodlot Owners would like to thank the speakers once again for their collaboration and for sharing their valuable knowledge. Thank you.